Good morning, teachers. Today we're going to introduce the kids to the concept of the multiplier effect. This is something that's going to come up not just in this unit when we talk about fiscal policy, but again in a slightly different application in the next unit when we talk about monetary policy. So this is something that's going to come up again and again and again. So I usually spend 2 days making sure the kids understand the multiplier effect, usually a day of kind of introducing the concept and making sure they know how to do the math, and then another day of practice and group activities, making sure that they actually know how to do it. Sometimes when I'm doing it on the board, they'll be like, oh yeah, I totally get that. And then if you give them a problem, they have a little bit of difficulty actually applying it. So I usually spend 2 full days on this. You could probably get away with doing it in 60 minutes, maybe a period and a half. But I like to spend 2 full days just to make sure, because it is something that's extremely important. So the multiplier effect is kind of the first introduction their kids are going to get to what we call counter-cyclical policy. And this is basically your combination of fiscal and monetary policy where the government attempts to control the business cycle. They don't need to know what fiscal and monetary policy are at this exact point. We're going to cover that later in the unit. But what they do need to know is that when the economy is in a recession, the government often tries to increase GDP. They would like to increase GDP growth in an attempt to lower the unemployment rate, because unemployment is our primary problem during recessions. And they need to know that when the economy is in recoveries, generally the government looks to control or slow GDP growth, preventing hyperinflation. So no matter what the economy is doing, the government's engaging in some form of countercyclical policy, trying to make sure that we keep the business cycle at a slow and steady pace. If you look over to the right here, you'll see prior to the invention of macroeconomics in the 40s and 50s, our economy for hundreds of years was undergoing what we call the boom and bust cycle, where you had relatively rapid growth, which everybody was really happy about, until that rapid growth created inflation and caused a complete economic crash. And so we do not want to have instability in our economy. We don't want the boom and bust cycle going through. So if you look below the boom and bust cycle, you'll see a well-regulated economy with good countercyclical policy kind of smooths out the bumps in the road. So your highs are less high, but your lows are less low. You're looking to have slow, steady, long-term growth because businesses like stability. They don't like the boom and bust cycle. And so stable and stability in our growth basically allows us to encourage businesses to engage in long-term investment. If I don't know if the economy is going to crash next year, I'm less likely to invest than if I know that even if the economy goes into recession, things are going to be relatively okay. So boom and bust cycle is bad, and countercyclical policy is our attempt to control it. So if we know that the goal of countercyclical policy is essentially to control GDP and GDP growth, it's important to remember what the components of GDP are, as these are the things we're going to be changing to control GDP. So those 4 components, just for reference, are consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. So theoretically speaking, since C plus IG plus G plus XN equals Y, which is GDP, theoretically speaking, an increase in any of these components should increase GDP, and a decrease in any of these components should decrease GDP. The problem is, and the thing that makes it a little bit more complicated, is that a change in consumer spending or a change in government spending doesn't lead to a one-to-one trade-off between spending and GDP. So an increase of investment spending by $1 actually increases GDP by substantially more than $1. So it's a little bit more tricky than that simple formula would lead you to believe. The reason why you don't get that one-to-one trade-off, it's not $1 of spending equals $1 of GDP, is because of that key important concept that we learned earlier in the year, which is that one person's spending becomes another person's income. So if I go to the store and I spend $100, that $100 doesn't just disappear out of the economy. It now becomes somebody else's paycheck, or it becomes orders from that store for additional products to restock their inventories. And those paychecks and those restocking inventories wouldn't have occurred had I not chosen to spend my money. Like if I had saved the money in the bank account, then that additional spending would never have actually occurred. So what we say in eco is that spending begets additional spending, which is to say that spending is essentially a chain reaction. And my choice to go and spend, let's say, $100 at Target will actually result in Target spending money, and then Target's employees spending money, and then wherever they spend their money, their employees spending money, and so forth and so on throughout the economy. So this money is going to transfer hands many, many different times and lead to a lot more spending than just my initial $100 expenditure. So to calculate exactly how much additional spending is going to happen due to my choice to go spend $100. We need to have the multiplier effect, which is what we're going to be learning about here. So long story short, we're looking to control GDP in order to get long-term stable growth in the economy. To do so is a little more complicated than what it seemed to be earlier on because GDP grows by a multiple of the initial change in spending. And so if we're going to change consumer spending or government spending or exports, we need to understand how much GDP is going to grow as a result of those changes, and it's going to be a multiple of the initial expenditure.